Thank you for joining us today. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're joining us from. My name is Allison Cuff-Shamoka. I have the privilege of serving as the Chief Operating Officer for TransCelerate, and I also have the privilege of serving as the moderator for today's panel, the Inspiring Inclusion, the Power of Pivotal Moments. So thank you for being with us. We are here today to mark International Women's Day. Technically, it's in 2 days on Friday, March 8th, but we're marking it today. And it is a day of celebrating the social, economic, cultural achievements of women. It is also a day that serves as a call to action for accelerating equality. Now, as I sit here with this incredible panel, who I will introduce to you in a moment, I think it's easy to take the progress that we've made on equality and inclusion for granted, but we all know that there is so much more work to do. So the theme for this year's International Women's Day is Inspiring Inclusion, hence the title for today's session. And the journey to a more inclusive world is built off of a series of moments, small and large, and they build over time to drive progress. And each moment inspires and challenges us to do more in the journey towards equality. So today, you are going to hear from some amazing leaders representing a diverse set of organizations from across the healthcare ecosystem who share a common passion for challenging the status quo in drug development. They'll share with you their personal and professional journeys to create a more inclusive environment for women, where women are equally represented at all levels of the organizations that design and run clinical trials, and importantly, where women are equally represented in the trials themselves. So with that, let's get to it. I'm going to start off with some introductions. Now, each of the people on our panel has an impressive background, and I could easily spend at least the first half of this discussion going through their biographies. I'm not going to do that because you all have Google for that, for those of you that are dialed in. So if that's what you want to do, go ahead and Google. I'm going to keep this pretty quick. So starting first with Joni Rutter. So Joni is the director of the National Center for Advancing Translational Sciences, also known as NCATS, at the National Institutes of Health. Here, she oversees the planning and execution of the center's programs that aim to overcome scientific and operational barriers impeding the development and delivery of new treatments and other health solutions. Seated next to Joni is Janice Chang. She is the CEO of TransCelerate, and she has been with the organization since its inception and has been pivotal in growing the organization from just an idea to what it is today. Seated next to Janice, we have Dr. Janet Woodcock. She is the former principal deputy commissioner at the Food and Drug Administration. She only just recently retired from this role. She joined the FDA in 1986, and in her time there, served in numerous leadership roles, including as the acting commissioner from January 2021 to February 2022. She has been bestowed with many awards and honors that are far too numerous for me to list out here. Next to Janet, we have Rob Goodwin. Rob serves as the Senior Vice President and Head of Clinical Development and Operations within Pfizer Research and Development. Rob has over 30 years of industry experience in clinical operations, safety, and regulatory. And then finally, to my left, Esther Krofah. She is the Executive Vice President of Health for the Milken Institute Health. She leads FasterCures, the Center for Public Health, Feeding Change, and the Center for the Future of Aging. So it's quite a panel we have here today, and they are very eager to talk to one another. So I'm going to go ahead and just get right into it with our first question. And with this first question, I want each of the panelists to reflect a little bit on their backgrounds. So Janet, I will start with you. And the question I have is, what does inspiring inclusion mean to you, particularly as you reflect on your career?
Certainly. Well, of course, I've been in a field much of my life that hasn't been fully represented with women and many other groups. To me, the most important thing is an attitude of openness and humility. I feel that so many people bring unconscious biases to their assessment of others, and to bring an attitude of humility, that I don't know everything, that every single person has something to offer that I don't bring to the table, and also openness to hear from others. I think is the most important attribute that a leader can have to really enable inclusion in an organization. And I mean leader at any level.
Esther, I'd love to hear your thoughts as you think about your career journey.
Yes, I've been thinking about this quite a bit, and I wanted to bring the international component to the conversation. I have an immigrant story. I was born in Nigeria in a small town called Anyigba, which you can barely identify on a map, and went through, of course, the typical story of coming here to the United States. Fortunate to have very hardworking parents that really underscored the importance of education and how we can attain the best education in this country. But importantly, not for ourselves, but for other people, right? So the idea of inclusion for me is that whatever you achieve with your own skills and talents are for the benefit of the public good and the global public good. And whether you're from a small town in the middle of nowhere in another country, or a small town here in the United States, your voice matters. And we need to create forums and spaces and places where those voices are reflected. By nature of having those diverse voices, you bring different kinds of solutions. One, you understand a broader spectrum of the challenges and problems that different communities face. And then you think more creatively around what those solutions ought to be. From a whole variety of perspectives, the people you hire, the kinds of issues that you take on, who you bring together to solve those issues, and ultimately, how do we ensure that the communities are benefiting from the solutions that are put forward?
Thank you, Esther. Joni, I'd love to get you to comment, please.
Sure. Well, Esther, I didn't know this about you, that you were from a small town. And I'm from a small town in the United States, from Kansas. I think you can identify it on a map if you're looking for it. But when I was growing up, now 50, or I shouldn't say the number, but too late now. 50 years ago or so, it was at a time and when I had two older brothers, and it was in a time where girls and women were holding positions like secretaries, and maybe not necessarily going beyond high school. But my mother, who was Dorothy from Kansas, as it turns out, my mother, she had this magnet on our refrigerator that said something that I think about in terms of inclusivity. And in the societal perspective, I think about it in terms of how we want to make sure that we're including people who may not otherwise be included normally or typically. And the magnet said, I want my daughter to not grow up to marry a doctor, but to grow up to become one. And little did I know that I would actually grow up to become a doctor, a PhD in genetics, also in a field I think that was largely, largely male dominated, but not exclusively. But certainly in the field of genetics, everyone has probably heard the story of Watson and Crick and Franklin. But maybe less so of the woman who really is credited with a lot of the findings in the early days of the structure of DNA. And so I think that has always stuck with me, and it has then translated into a professional sort of way I think about inclusivity, which is more about making sure you bring the voices in that aren't represented currently, so that you get that inclusivity of thought and perspective. And so with that, I think in the science world, I often think about the understanding of genetics really requires us to have an understanding of a lot of other areas of science, a lot of understanding about how to bring in different populations to understand and learn from them the population genetics and things of that nature. So I think that has always stuck with me, and so it taught me too to just be more about in the field that was male dominated, more listening, take a listening posture. And then when I'm ready to speak, I speak. But other than that, I try to let others speak, but let my actions speak loudly as well.
Rob.
Wow. So first, thank you for allowing me to be on this panel with this wonderful group of women. It's very humbling. I think Janet used that word earlier. My journeys may be different, maybe being a male, right, and thinking about this. And when I first started my career, I know I did not understand inclusion. It probably was not the thing I even thought about, to be very honest. And then I had the benefit, really, of growing up in an environment, through my career where it mattered, right? So whether it be from very strong women that I worked with or males, what I learned was that the power of inclusion in the workforce is very important. Of course, in our daily lives as well, but particularly in the workforce as you think about the work we do in clinical trials and making sure all those perspectives are there. But also, importantly, is also how you engage a workforce. So, when I think about the people I've worked for, I've always taken a little bit of something from everyone, whether it be a leader or a colleague that, side by side with. And that's inspired me to think about, in the company I work for now, how we engage that workforce, how I personally want to inspire others really to follow that path. There was one of my last bosses once said to me, you got to stay strong in the saddle, right? If this really matters, right, then you have to model those behaviors. And when I look at, the workforce that we have in today, 50% of our leaders that are senior VPs or above in our Pfizer research and development are females. On my own leadership team for clinical development, 50% to 80% are females. And it's not by chance in a way. It's because they're the most qualified individuals for those roles. And I feel very inspired every day when I see them and what they do and then how they bring others into the workforce. I have a daughter, right? And my daughter was able to meet Janice recently. And what I want her also to understand is that you can do anything you want, right? And when you meet others that have really kind of moved up that chain of life, you can take a little bit of something from everyone. And so that's what I find inspiring, particularly for, as a person, but then also when I think of my daughter and what I want for her.
Yeah, absolutely. Janice, just to close out the personal reflections to start the panel.
Yeah, and I knew I was going to get lost in part of just listening to the panelists, and I did. So maybe just a few reactions to what I heard and share a little bit about my experience. One, I think we touched on making sure inclusion is really ensuring everyone's voices are heard. But I think as leaders, it's about making sure that they are heard consistently. Right? That consistency is really key. So it's not one time and we heard your voice and you're done. But also, it's important to remember we all have different styles and voices can be heard in different ways, different formats, even in body language. So there's something really important as leaders for us to make sure we foster a consistent, safe environment for those voices to be heard. Metrics and numbers are not going to drive, and they're not going to inspire inclusion. But stories, the stories are not the fairy tale stories I tell my 7-year-old at bedtime, but it's the personal stories we just started to hear, right? And I think stories, those personal, people crave authenticity and transparency. And when I hear those authentic stories, connections are being fostered, trust is being fostered, and that can completely change the way a dialogue is approached. And I think that's really important for us to think about and remember. From my perspective, I immigrated to the US when I was 12. And I remember two things. I did not know the language or the alphabets. And I remember two things vividly from the early months. I really struggled with the flavor of cheese. Now, I'm a huge cheese lover now, but early days, I was really, it was everywhere. And the second one was, boy, it's hard enough, I have a 12-year-old. It's hard enough being a 12-year-old teenage girl and not having the language and the tool, and having to build new tools to build those meaningful connections as a teenager was really hard. And maybe tying to something Joni mentioned, But what I didn't realize, and now reflecting back as part of my career, I had to be an active listener. I had to be very observant in reading people's cues and body language and how they communicate to me. And I'm so grateful for that experience now, so that I can bring those skill set, being active listening and observant, to my day-to-day interactions, because I do think those skill sets allow me to be a more inclusive leader, hopefully in my day-to-day.
Absolutely. It's interesting. So, the title of our panel today is, Inspiring Inclusion, the Power of Pivotal Moments. And, Joni, you shared a really nice anecdote about the magnet, right? And it's not a one-time thing. Obviously, you looked at that magnet across your life. But for me, there are so many moments. I was just reflecting of when did I notice how much inclusion mattered and how much I had the power to inflect inclusion. And I had a personal memory. It was one of my very first jobs where I got to be a part of resume screening and the interviewing process. And so I was doing my thing. I was screening resumes, and a senior person on the teams commented on how there was a common profile for every single person that I was selecting, and it was that they were like me. And I have such gratitude that someone older than, and this was before there was a lot of dialogue about inclusion, called me on it, because it was a real wake-up call to me of, I need to do this differently, because that shouldn't be how it is, right? I definitely have some unconscious bias in terms of how I am selecting these. And so what I'd love to just take a moment, I know that all of us have an array of anecdotes in their head of wow, that really influenced me. And it could be in terms of how you think about inclusion on a more personal level, or even as we think about it more systematically, right? If there's a story that you would like to share, because to Janice's point, I think there's a lot of power in storytelling. So Joni, if you're all right, I thought I would start with you.
Sure. It's an interesting thing that you say. I think that that the affinity bias is real and present, and I think I don't know that I recognized it as much until I became the director of NCATS and kind of had a different vantage, I guess, of the workforce and what we needed to do to create a culture and an environment that would be safe for people to bring thoughts, ideas, concerns all to the table. They can't all bring them to me. They need to bring them to their supervisors, and then and then go forward in that way. But what I started to see was that there were pockets of this affinity bias, and so I think that the idea of recognizing that is so important. And I think also, as I went through my career as a geneticist, working in the field of genetics, I started to be a part of the All of Us research program when it was just beginning. And the important factor there that I think is going to make all of us really powerful is that we made a call up front that we needed to make sure that we had a majority of the minority populations included. And that was not an easy sell out of the gate, because people were used to bringing in people who were like them when they're involved in research activities. So we made a very big point that we actually may slow down because we need you to do this in the way where we bring in a majority minority. And because we said we are not going to just start off and then go back, that wouldn't work. Mm-hmm. So we started out from the very beginning doing that. And I think that today that still holds true how it is playing out. And I'm really gratified to see that. So I think...
And you had a scientific rationale for doing it that
way.
We
did.
Too, which I think is very powerful.
That's right.
In, persuading others.
We needed to do that.
Yes.
Yeah, the genetics community, as you know, a lot of the research findings were in the white Caucasian population. That had to change.
Yeah.
And the other things that I learned there, though, were how to be inclusive. So you can't just say, I want to do this. I want to go get these populations. Right. It's not about helicoptering in. It's actually about engaging them. So we supported groups and communities that we wanted to be at the table. And we also made sure that our consent forms were in another language. Spanish was the one we started with. And even then, you can't just do a direct translation. We learned that the word study turned into investigación. And that's not a that culturally is not a good word for the Hispanic population. So including the communities, the Hispanic communities, to help us identify those kinds of issues that related to the cultural needs of the community was super important. So I can't estimate it, or I can't say enough how much of value it is to bring in this importance of inclusivity, to make those pivotal moments that you don't necessarily see immediately, but by including those individuals who can help you navigate those issues, they can help drive those points home and make sure that your studies are well designed in that way. We have a long way to go still in many areas, but I think that that's certainly been a lesson that stuck with me for quite a while.
Anyone else from the group have something they want to share?
I'm happy to, yes. As you were just talking, I thought about, and your story as well, I'm just thinking about the pivotal moments. And for many of us, especially if you're coming from the background where you're in a population that's typically underserved, it's not just about one moment. It's all of the moments, and you live it every single day.
Yep.
You know, I'll give you some examples. George Floyd, what happened during the pandemic in 2020, that confluence of both the social challenges that erupted as well as a health emergency. And I had many colleagues come to me to say, wow, I didn't know that was your experience. How are you feeling about being a Black woman in America? I'm like, well, this is every day. This is not just this particular moment. It may be acute for you, but this is the context in which we get up and take care of our families and go to work and lead organizations and identify issues. And what that in some ways reflects is that we just need to be cognizant, again, of what I said earlier, who you have around the table, because they bring those experiences to bear. So it's not just one moment for me, but it's all of those moments. The second is that as I think about those who are suffering from different disease conditions, you were talking about the All of Us research study, Joni. For much of the research issues and the disease areas that we're studying, the impacted populations are racial and ethnic minorities. Of course, it's historical. Of course, it's systematic and systemic in this country. But we have to really be intentional about how we are choosing to address those challenges. And we were going upwards, and we talked about this too, Janet. 40% of the U.S. population is going to be, racial and ethnic minorities, and then in some cases for maternal and child health, an issue I worked on early in my career, 40% or 4 times more likely, right, these Black women to have poor health outcomes, cardiovascular disease, cancer. I mean, just go down the list. At some point, we have to get embarrassed and say that, at some point we have to say, this is not okay compared to other high-income countries. These are the health outcomes that we are okay with continuing as status quo. We cannot continue as status quo. And so all of these moments for me, they add up. My father died 1.5 years ago from cancer. He was diagnosed at stage 4. We are fortunate that even in that late diagnosis, he had access to some of the best medical care. Of course, we had to be very involved as family caregivers. But that also is a call to action. Are individuals like him included in clinical trials and clinical research? Do we give a voice to those who are voiceless? So as I think about my career, I really see this call to action because I'm invited to be around all the tables, a lot of tables, Joni's table and Janet's table and others, and Janice's table and so forth, to give voice to the voiceless and to say we need to be intentional. We cannot all just dwell on one moment. For many of us that live it, it's all about our lives every single day. And how do we ensure that the solutions that we are developing are not, we developed this for you, but you're with us identifying and helping co-create and co-construct those solutions together.
And that's where I think with the pandemic, it maybe for most was, maybe that highlighted a lot of the issues. They've always been there, right? We would talk about inclusivity in clinical research. But unless you're measuring it and really understanding it, you have to have a baseline. And we made a conscious effort to publish 10 years worth of data on our clinical trials. And it wasn't good, right? But it set a baseline for us, kind of like that call to action. And when we were developing the vaccine, what we realized is that it has to be for everyone. And of course, you always know this, but to your point, you have to be intentional.
Yeah.
And so we got really intentional about the sites we were choosing, making sure they were in the right areas. We got very intentional about, can you have after office hours? Can you have things on weekends? And at times we would actually pause recruitment at some of the sites if they weren't, hitting the targets that we needed. So we had to get very intentional about everything that we did, finding the right influencers, et cetera. I think that was a moment for me that you realized, if we can do that for COVID, why aren't you doing it for everything else, right? Why did that have to be the moment, right? That, and if you're doing all these
But I'm
different
glad
things.
it was the moment.
I think we're all glad it was the moment, but now how do you take that and continue
How do we
it?
not backslide?
Yes,
That's right.
exactly.
And that's always the worry. Like, how do you keep us sort of on the right path?
Yep.
Right? It's always easy to slide back.
Yeah.
It's the
Janice, yeah.
intentionality plus consistency. I think, the quote says, to drive lasting, enduring change requires one step at a time. And leadership is not an event, or you drive change. You don't go to the gym for 9 days and expect to be transformed, right? You gotta keep at it. Some of us might, but right. Or we were talking about orchids, and I can't just go dump a bunch of ice cubes, which apparently not the right way to do it. You can't expect success, right? And it's not an event. It's not an intensity. It's about being consistent and believe in the cause. And weathering through the barriers, but really lead by example. I tell my kids, and it's easier said than done. It's choosing to do the right thing even when it's the harder thing to do. That's key.
And I think as leaders, we are in a position to not just say those types of things, but also to recognize the infrastructure inequities in the communities, and that we want to continue to be consistent and intentional with. And that takes time, it takes money, it takes workforce development, it takes resources. And I think that there needs to continue to be an intentionality behind our ability to build that infrastructure to make sure that we're setting ourselves up for success for the future.
Yeah.
When we were preparing for this panel, we got into a really interesting discussion about the journey that we've been on with inclusion, and how there have been some moments of the word I think we used was backlash, right? Mm-hmm. And how we can manage through that. And Jenna, I believe you were the one that brought up, I'd love if you could comment a little bit more on what you meant, because I feel like it is a little bit linked when you talk about the time and the intentionality and how it can be hard depending on how it is perceived by others.
Right. Well, I think in this time, right now, in this era in the United States, we are seeing some sentiments among some parts of the population that these types of efforts are going too far, okay? Yeah. And that they're unfair to others, right? And that's what I mean by humility and openness. I think we have to include and listen to those folks as well and understand what their issues might be. Because what we're talking about here is not that. It's not what they're objecting to, okay? But somehow something's been lost in translation. And, I think, Janice, I agree with you. My experience, of course, I've always been out there my whole career. And so change management is really hard. And there's always a giant number of people who don't want to, I've been saying to people, I can't understand why people give me awards and everything, because every single person has opposed every single thing I've tried to do. Right? So how come now it's okay, right? Or at least that's how it feels, right? Every change I've tried to bring about for 30 years, right? Just, no. And so we shouldn't be surprised at this, okay? Mm-hmm. Because it really is a regular human. But I feel like, frankly, some of the rhetoric on either side actually isn't inclusive, okay? Mm-hmm. Including those who are on the side of inclusion. And that isn't going to be successful. That's kind of my take on this, if you're interested. I mean, is that we have to include and listen to those who are experiencing these negative feelings and try to figure out what are they, where are they coming from, why are they experiencing, engage with them as well as with sort of the people who are trying to push forward on this. Mm-hmm. And that's usual in change management.
Yeah. Can I just jump in on that?
Please.
I mean, I think language matters. I think that's what you were trying to get to. Language matters significantly because it could feel exclusive to those who may not who may understand the underlying goal, but the way you used your language and the tone that's being communicated almost feels as though you are trying to favor one community to the detriment of another community. And that's actually not what we mean at all.
No.
What we're trying to say is let's include everyone. And what I love about some illustrations around, equality and equity is that everyone needs maybe a slightly different level in order to be able to look over the fence. If you remember that picture that people have used in the past.
Yeah, and as a member of the short group of people,
Yes,
I totally agree with you. I need a stool.
It might all be a little challenging.
I am the shortest in my family. I need a little bit of that extra bump up. But what we're talking about is every community, whether you're in the rural community, whether you're in an urban setting, whether you're in poor, whether you're in wealthy, how do we just ensure that we have fit for purpose policies that are relevant to each of those communities? Yeah. The second thing that I would say is that we need to move from the moral obligation to the business imperative, right? The way we talk about inclusion and diversity is really sometimes driven by almost an apology, right? We did wrong, and so we need to correct that from a moral perspective. And of course, there is a moral perspective and social justice perspective that's really about a business imperative. We're thinking about the sustainability and not the short-term play here, because the long-term sustainability, you can certainly relate and talk about this, is that we have whole communities that can benefit from medicines, right? We're talking about clinical trials from medicines, and they want to know, is that medicine going to work on me, for me? Was I included in that research? Am I in an average, right? And the average was a bit, constructed by other communities. And so there's a business imperative to say, you were included in this research. This medicine may benefit you depending on whatever the outcome is. And therefore, you can get access to this medicine for the condition in which you're struggling with. I mean, we talk about this from a whole variety of different perspectives, whether it's chronic disease or rare diseases, Joni, with all of your work, that all these communities just want to know a simple answer. I'm sick. Can I get access to an intervention, a product, a therapy, a vaccine that's helpful for me? And was I included in that clinical research? And the business part of it also then goes to say, as you're making decisions about sites, do those providers have experience with these medicines? And they can then talk to their communities effectively about these medicines. And if they're never included in the research, right, we know the timeline from research and studies to intervention could be upwards of 10 years. The communities might never have access to the latest therapeutic or benefit from it. So it's really, for me, about changing it from a moral conversation to a business conversation.
Also, there's a scientific imperative here, particularly like for genetics. I mean, if you just study a certain, somewhat homogeneous population, you're not going to understand actually basic variability and what drives it and so forth. So, and that's, I think, true in drug development as well.
Absolutely. And, when you think about those that we work with in the communities, the first thing you have to think about is, so goal setting, because to make it intentional, right, it's not just about, what does census look like and what does the epidemiology look like, but then you got to think about, okay, am I selecting the right demographic of the sites to be able to get in those communities? And if not, then what do we need to do then to be able to help in those communities to really, bring about the right individuals that can have the conversation, because it's somebody like them that they're going to listen to, that they're going to understand. That's a big part of what we need to do, and you got to make that piece intentional.
Well, but I'll give you a hard time about this.
Of course you will.
You need not only a relationship with those folks, but they need to have the infrastructure resources to be able to perform. Like during the pandemic, it was very clear that the preferred sites of the pharmaceutical industry could perform very rapidly. They'd been trained, they had the infrastructure, they had the resources. We had people, dying in satellite hospitals in the ICU. They couldn't be enrolled in the trials, right? Because they'd never done any research and they'd never been invited and supported. So I think the current efforts that are going on are really, really important in this regard, because it isn't, like you said, it's not just a moment. It's going to be a commitment over time and take money.
It takes money and time, and you're right, because in most cases, right, we do a lot of work at a lot of the academic research.
Yeah.
And who can afford to go to those, right? And so it's absolutely clear that we have to get closer into the communities and we have to develop the infrastructure.
Right.
And it's not just one company, it's actually a society that we have to take on that responsibility and do it.
Yeah.
There's a life cycle to it, right? It's the research life cycle. If we want to continue to do research, we need to be continuing to engage with the communities who need them.
And that's where I give NIH some grief, okay?
Yeah,
because
I know you do.
can't
I'm glad to
just,
give somebody else some grief.
all equal opportunity
We'll get the time. Yeah.
grants, the structure of grants. So
Yes.
you go in there, you give them money, and then you go away.
Yes.
Or you have to make some giant application again. And it is, in PCORI, I'm on the PCORI board, and, I'm constantly saying infrastructure. We've, sure, it's wonderful to give out these grants and blah, 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 and everything, and the great basic science, but it's not really going to advance the clinical research infrastructure to do things that way.
Yeah, and to that point too, I think one of the things that I'd like to see us do even more in grants is talk about not just then the research that's needed, but also how do we ensure that we're building in access to care?
Yeah.
How do we think about what are the questions that this research will need to ask the FDA? What are the questions that this research will need to ask CMS? And start to build those in early on in that life cycle, and talking about the communities, but also talking about how that will come back to the communities. And then one other thing I think that we're trying to really build upon is we've been talking about this on the clinical side, but we're also thinking that this is very important on the preclinical side. We would love to see building in more of a sort of an equity lens on the models that we're building. We typically use rodent models and 2D cell culture models, but now we're working on 3D bioprinted models and tissue chips and multiple organs on a chip, et cetera. These are new types of models that need new approaches, and we have the ability to bring in that equity lens now that we've never had before. And I think that is going to be imperative as we move forward in that space, especially with the Modernization Act.
Can I just push back on the grant piece for just a moment? Because I had an aha moment just last week. I was speaking with a pastor of a large church who was involved in the COVID trials, the Novavax trials in particular. And just exactly what you said, there was a helicopter science to some degree, where they came in, built capacity for engaging in trials, and then went away. And I said, okay, well, what you need are grants to establish your infrastructure. He says, Esther, I don't want to talk about grants anymore. It feels like a charity. I want to be part of the business of being a site operator where I have ongoing transactions. And by the way, we do a whole variety of other things. We do screening, we provide food, we provide access to different services, education, awareness. We are a one-stop shop in our community, and I don't want hand-me-down grants anymore. Can I be considered and qualified as a site provider of and work with a whole variety of different partners as a partner of choice? And that moves us a bit away from this sometimes paternalistic top-down perspective. Apply for this grant, we'll give it to you for a certain number of years. By the way, it's sort of like trickle-down economics. We'll give it to the academic institutions, and hopefully at some point it'll come down to you, which in some ways ends up not really coming down to them. And when it does, it's in really incremental small dollars that it cannot do big transformational things. So I think we just need to think about it from a nuanced perspective. And I could only get that insight. Why? Because I talked to somebody who was outside of our typical community, and I said, grants. He said, Esther, I don't want to talk about grants anymore. Or is there a different model?
And that's interesting too, because in order for it to be sustainable, it has to be a business. Many clinical trialists, regardless of where they are in the United States, often only do one trial because they lose money.
It's such a pain
And
behind.
that's right. There's all these things associated with it, right? So imagine an organization that has never done it before and comes in the first time, and they get all this handhold, and then they're left to go off and do. Like, it is training in the business aspect of it. How do you sort of create a business out of this? And that's where probably most of the efforts needs to be, to create a sustainable business that cares for people, but also then can engage in clinical research because they're not losing, funds to do such.
And clinical trials are changing. We're seeing more, drug modalities that are in the, very specific precision medicine kinds of space that are starting to come along. We're going to need innovative ways that's going to require these also innovative ways of engaging in this way. So,
well, there's almost like competing, because the more the precision medicines come through, the infrastructure required to run them is different.
yes,
And that can be in direct tension to
Yes.
what we're trying to
Right.
do with more inclusivity. It gets to something that we talked about, which is having to play the long game. Not just the intentionality, but it's, COVID was a moment and a lot of flurry of activity. And from what I'm hearing, there's a lot of concerns around backsliding precisely because of what you were talking about with, well, the new sites, I don't know if they can do it. Maybe we're going to go back to the old way. It's more, and so I think one of the words we used when you were talking about this was resiliency, right? The need for resiliency, and in our leaders around that. And so, I'd just love to get, your thoughts on, how do we think about that resiliency and supporting, not just, you're all leaders, you're all living this, but you have many leaders that report up to you, and in many ways it's a ground game too. It's both at the top and the bottom of the organization. How are you thinking about cultivating that resiliency? Because it can get emotional and it can get personal, but it takes a long game. So Rob, if you could start there.
Sure. So it has to be part of our culture. For any organization, it's part of your culture and how you model those behaviors, right? I talked about early in my career how I didn't think about these things. I just had no idea, like when I came out of school, but there were models, people that I could model myself after, and you develop in a culture. So you have to set the culture right at the top, which means you have to be visible about it, right? And resiliency comes from, even when you get the pushback, that's when you develop bigger ears and a smaller mouth, right? And you listen more, right?
That's good.
You
I like that. That's a great
You spend more
metaphor.
time listening and understanding, and when you can do that and engage, then you can understand more about what the things you need to do to be more resilient. It might be how words matter, as you're saying, Esther, right? So what are the words we choose? And then how do you put that into action in the programs? Because really what we want is, where we're not having conversations about this at some point, because it's just part of the DNA,
Yes.
right? And whether it be in our workforce, or whether it be in how we conduct clinical trials, it's just how it's done. And you don't worry about sliding back, because it's just, nobody could think about it any differently. And so it starts with us. We have to demonstrate that every day. I mentioned that quote, be strong in the saddle, right? So when it gets hard, right, you have to stay on and ride, right?
Yeah.
And demonstrate that you can do it. And so I think that it starts there.
Can I just add, I am a policy junkie. That's what I love doing, thinking about all day, every day. And the question of resiliency for me means there must be some considerations for carrots and sticks. And I know it's not popular probably, but just going back, like, how do you build it in culture? A great example is just what happened with diversity action plans, I would have to say, which is that FDA put out guidance, 4 or 5, I can't even count how many, on diversity, equity, and clinical trials, which were a strong encouragement, gave ideas, recommendations, strategies, etc. But I have not seen this shift and movement by larger organizations, right, that are submitting and putting products or submissions in front of FDA without the diversity action plan requirement. I'm not saying it's perfect or it's a panacea and it covers it all, but just that one bit of a requirement has forced, you can clarify to me, internally for companies to say, what are we doing? Are we doing this? How do we put the infrastructure in place? How do we put the resources behind this? I see all kinds of hires right within companies now that they're like the diversity, equity, inclusion chief for clinical trials. Did we see this at this scale 4 or 5 years ago? Perhaps not. So that might be more of the stick component to some degree, but I think the carrot component is, in some ways, is the healthy competition. When one does it, they want to say, wait, I'm a leader in this area. And the peers look around and say, well, I want to be differentiated and I want to be a leader. So there is that positive reinforcement. But I just have to think from a policy perspective, we have to look at the full set of solutions. It's not just FDA. There's a bigger infrastructure around, or bigger set of players around clinical trials. It's also NIH, is also going to be on point of care and the primary sites. I think a big part of the last movers are the health plans. Where are they in this conversation in terms of funding, evidence generation on interventions that have good health outcomes, I haven't seen them be as big of a part of the conversation as we ought, especially in the post-market setting. So I agree, and I just wanted to add a little nuance there about some carrots and sticks from a policy perspective.
And I think policy sometimes lags.
Yeah,
And what I
sure.
mean by that is, and so I don't think about carrots and sticks, right? What I think about is, if you look at TransCelerate as an organization, we've been talking about diversity in clinical trials, we've been talking about inclusion for a very long time. And as member companies, we have been building plans together, we've been sharing data, like how are we going to do this? And in a way, I feel like sometimes the groundswell has to come from the bottom, and then you get sort of guidance in a policy that says, hey, this is how we're all going to do it, and then gets everybody else moving. And so I think of it more as a sort of an incentive to continue as opposed to the carrots and the sticks.
Sure. That might be the language. Use the right words.
Yes, language matters. Yes.
We just had a healthy debate about how language matters.
And I was going to add too that I think it has to also move out. It's beyond clinical trials, right? It's then moving into care.
Yeah.
And I think this is an area where we struggle. Dissemination and implementation of findings that we have might go well at the particular sites that have done the trials, or understanding methods, development, et cetera. But then you look at how it gets implemented in other sites or doesn't, and you have to consider all of the infrastructure that goes into the thinking behind that. You can't just if you look at the electronic health records, if at one site they're completely different at another site, and so implementing something even within an electronic health record is a major deal. And so I think how we start to drive the infrastructure development towards supporting these ideas is really the critical need. And so how do we make that change so that it does get into the care?
And it gets to something, and Janice, I'm going to call on you about this, is when we talk about the future vision for health, what we think clinical research needs to look like, it's the convergence of clinical research and clinical care, because that is when you start to get at that. I know, Janice, if you want to talk a little bit about how
we this didn't come up in our prep session, but I think this is where, I feel incredibly fortunate through TransCelerate, right? In terms of everything we do, we have such a big focus around how do we, in my words, right? How do we really think about aspirationally, instead of bringing patients to clinical research, how do we bring clinical research to patients? And then the infrastructure that needs to happen to really do it in a meaningful way. Much of what we do here at TransCelerate, and by the way, TransCelerate is not just the 21 member companies, right? It's really the ecosystem partners that all have throughout the decade supported our work. But really, how do we really think about evolving the patient's experience? You look around this table, and then you think about we all have traveled a different path to get here. And then you think about people we interact with, they all have a different path. And then you apply that to the communities of people that we live with and interact with. In some ways, we're all at a different point when you think about clinical research and clinical care. And that is our aspiration. But how do we do it in a way that's truly meaningful at an individual level? Much of our work at TransCelerate has really been focused around how do we create processes and tools in a collaborative way so that we can proactively engage with patients in a meaningful way and get their feedback, get their on a consistent manner throughout the clinical research process. And I think more importantly, I will say, the need for policy to be part of the conversation is very key, because to get to that clinical convergence of clinical research and clinical care, we need TransCelerate is one entity, and we can continue to chip away and develop very pragmatic solutions, which is we have done, but there will be required actions by other parts of the ecosystem. And regulators, sites, patient groups, policymakers, that's our hope, Allison, and I think that we're starting to have that conversation, but we've set that bold vision, and we are going to achieve it one step at a time, very pragmatic way. And we talked a little bit about resiliency. I do feel very incredibly fortunate through TransCelerate, where every day, right, change is hard. Change is really hard. But every day I get to see, our member companies working with ecosystems, stakeholders, just really coming together and do the right thing and demonstrating courage as well, courage to challenge ourselves, to say, why are we doing that? Why are we not doing it differently? What's the barrier? and then be resilient about let's keep pushing forward. Let's keep pushing forward one step at a time.
And then how do we make sure we're not leaving the rural communities
Yes.
behind, the rare disease
Yes.
communities behind, who are invisible, and they have, they go to doctors all the time, but they're invisible in the electronic health record system because how they're built. And then ensuring that we can get to all of those communities. I think exactly how do we build in that resiliency there? And I think that's a challenge for us.
Yeah, well, I'll go along with Esther on this. We got to call some of the other parties in the ecosystem to the table here, because we're all swimming upstream on this, because the huge inequities, rural and blah, 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 and so forth, they're built into our healthcare system in the United States. And so everything we're trying to do is pushing against this tide of, cost
More demands.
optimization, profit, all for-profit entities and so forth. So that is very difficult, and I do think we have to put that on the table repeatedly, of course, which I've done, of course.
A real surprise to me was, during the pandemic, where if you had a visit that was through telemedicine, right? CMS said, hey, we'll reimburse it the same.
Right.
But I always write about those things sliding, because in these communities, right, where you don't have a lot of these, if you want to bring care,
That's
right,
It's the only
it has to be done a different way.
Right.
So to your point, we can't, sometimes we're trying to push it, but it's not sustainable, because when we're done, it disappears, right? I can drive a bus into the community, but when I'm done, my bus is leaving. So we got to think about what that will look like, the life cycle of care and all these things.
Well, tell what you just talked about, the telehealth, telemedicine, and the reasons that we eased on the prior, scope of practice issues and created some flexibilities was all around COVID. And COVID is waning, or it's happening to some degree, acknowledged, and some others not. But we need the next acute thing. And the next acute thing are multiple things, right? We have like an obesity epidemic in the country, and I would say probably in the world. We have a diabetes epidemic. We have all of these chronic diseases that are, in some ways, the trajectory is worse and not necessarily getting better.
That's right.
So how do we continue those flexibilities that worked very well for COVID? We need to tell a different story, which is rural communities are in crisis. And we need to solve that crisis. And we cannot let go of the innovation, technology and otherwise, that we implemented for a very acute pandemic when we have multiple acute epidemics that are happening in the country. And these are the solutions that we tested. They worked. Let's redeploy them.
That's right. It's interesting. I'm starting to visit some of the big retail chains and seeing what they're doing in the community. And honestly, I'm so impressed.
Yes.
Just because of how they're thinking, when you walk in, because these are individuals that may not have insurance or maybe underinsured. And I never know how much I'm paying for something. And I have to say, I probably have really good insurance, right? But you walk in, you can see on the board, right, what it's going to cost them and everything. I just found that really refreshing. And the environment that I was in, it felt like I was really going to get good care there, right? It wasn't some dingy environment. And I thought to myself, if I lived in this community, I think I'd want to come here, right? And it was really, I just think how others now are looking at it differently compared to maybe how I thought, maybe 5 or even 10 or maybe even 2 years ago, right? It's just really refreshing. And then you say, how can we get more involved in that? How can we use that as part of the system?
I'm with you. I mean, I've tried for years, as you know, to get a sort of behind-the-counter option for drugs, which the pharmaceutical industry opposed, right? Because, like, who walks into Walmart? People with diabetes, type 2 diabetes, people with untreated hypertension. Okay, they could get treated. It's not that hard to get your blood pressure done or something. We need to take the care to where the community is. Then we could have, just like we did with, remember how everybody, when influenza, they said the pharmacists couldn't give vaccinations. That would be terrible. That would be the end of the world. Okay, that's the only reason we got all these people vaccinated, right? Is because we took it out to where people are, took it to the patients. So I think that to be really successful, we're going to have a different model of care in the United States that is mediated through, look at the success now of urgent care. A lot of people get their health care that way because it's almost impossible to get to see a doctor in a normal setting. So I do believe that some really rethinking of how we deliver the care, both the telehealth, but also with sites that where people are and can get to, would really help. And then, because, you know, with precision medicine, for example, we're not going to be, it requires a larger patient base, okay? Because you only have a small fraction of people who've identified with the disease have that specific, whatever it might be, that means you might be targeting them. And so we can't just go to the same sites all the time, you know, traditional sites and their patient base. And we don't want to just go around and suck people out of the community, like you said. So it means we have to have a larger base of care, but that is, and with new technology, you know, we could, that care can easily be connected to the most advanced researchers.
And there was something very interesting, and I'm not giving the names of any chains, but it was very interesting what I learned. Again, talk about having bigger ears and a smaller mouth, okay? Just understanding how things are done where, you know, my mom had diabetes, and she would always think, she'd say, my sugar, right? And she'd think, well, if I don't eat those donuts, I'm gonna be fine,
That's
right? But what I learned in one of the chains when I was working with them was when they treat someone, then they have an app, and they walk into the food sections, and they show them what to eat and what not to eat. And I thought, that's what my mom needed, right? To know that don't hide from me the donuts in the oven, right? And think you're doing okay, right? But to know what types of foods to eat. And that's what really impressed me, which was, it was the circle. And really understanding people, not just the medication, but then, you know, all the follow through.
Well, and to Esther's point, that's the incentive. Okay, because people want to go back to there because they're doing the whole care for the patient.
You know what else that it's addressing that we haven't talked about is the trust factor.
And the trust.
The trust, right? Because we can talk about trust from these communities don't trust us because we did everything wrong. We cite the studies that were very, very wrong for good reason. But when you implement these transformative care models, right? Care in the community, and you're there for the long haul, and you're working with a business partner that is trusted, right? I'm going in for my toilet paper. I'm going in for my toothpaste. I know that and you've gone to them for years, and then you're now accessing healthcare services at a facility, a place that you trust. Then over time, that trust only continues to grow because they know that that retailer is not moving. They're not leaving their community because they have been there. So I think we need to take the whole trust conversation and less about the negatives of what we did wrong and start to invest in these new models and also in the providers that are trustworthy, right? Pharmacists, that was a fantastic example. Pharmacists see these patients every single day. They can advise and say, you know, I saw you last month when you came in to pick up your diabetes medicine, and I can also help you with your food as medicine prescription, right? How do we leverage pharmacists more? How do we leverage community health workers more? First of all, let's pay them. That would be fantastic. And then let's leverage them, right?
Sorry, exactly.
But
sorry, I was going to say that the whole concept of bringing it's stop fighting for the same patients. It's about
there's a whole universe.
There's a whole universe. We're all patients, right? And how do we bring research closer to the communities, to them? But I also think there's the aspect around getting just the mindset around. Right now we're managing diseases, but how do we get to the managing health? And that's that circle. Right? And then you working the trust model and making sure that the providers have the support, have the education, have the right incentives to really help us build that trust. We can't get to the patients in many ways without the providers.
I mean, just one final thing on trust, and I know, Janet, you wanted to come in, which is that if you look at poll after poll, trust in science has gone down. Trust in institutions that are science-based institutions, unfortunately, has gone down. But trust in business is up. I mean, because people trust that if I order something online, it's coming to my house. If I go to a store, they're going to have what I need. How do we just leverage where trust is and build and grow it from a health perspective, rather than looking at where trust is not?
Well, I think we enable these new setups to actually perform care for the community. I think your example is great because they were incentivized to develop this app for their customers, to make their experience better, to help, and it was to to help their health, okay? And that can provide real innovation. You can't see a doctor's office developing an app about what to eat, okay, in the store, because but they have the food and they have the pharmacy and so forth. So I do think also this will encourage more innovation. I mean, you could foresee, getting your genome scan done there, and
You could get retinal scans, actually.
all kind of things. Yeah,
Screenings. Yeah.
that's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
A gentleman in my group coined the term care anywhere,
Yeah.
and we stopped talking about decentralized trials or visits, and we just talk about care anywhere,
Right.
because then it can be in your home, it can be in the
That's
community,
right.
it can be anywhere.
That's
And I
right.
actually really like that term. I applaud him for that term because it makes you think differently,
Right.
right?
Yes.
It also empowers the person.
Yeah.
I mean, I think we don't we think about empowering the clinicians or the providers, but empowering the person to actually then take this up is, some easy kind of way of looking at this and using these capabilities. It empowers them, and then they will want to continue to do more because they will see change.
It's interesting because the next question that I was going to pose to all of you beat me to it, so that's why I didn't intervene. Because it was to double click on this concept of moving away from this sort of moral obligation, or moral imperative, to the business imperative. And for those that don't know, I kind of grew up in my career more on the provider side, and so I understand when you're talking about the complexities of making sure that we have access to care. I mean, there's a lot going on there right now. And I think that's at the heart of what you're talking about, is this business imperative to figure out how to make it work sustainably, to have clinical research out in the community. I don't know that we can separate that from the healthcare access imperative. And if we're going to sit here and talk about it, we have to model the behavior and start doing the collaboration across the ecosystem. And I know, Janet, it sounds like you've tried to do that a lot throughout your career, but I don't know if anyone has thoughts on that. And how are we doing, right? And what do you think, if you had to say, like, there are a few things, for any of you, like, that we could do meaningfully to start inflecting that? What do you think needs to happen to start bringing that together in a more meaningful way?
I think we're doing miserably.
Don't mince words.
Right. Right. I think that, we have the best of times and the worst of times in the United States. We have this, and that's what the medical schools, the large medical centers, they want that cutting edge care, your transplants, your CAR T cells, your gene therapy, or what have you.
They want the new, interesting science.
Yeah, yeah, and also they're delivering like the cutting edge of all kinds of care out there, and then they have all the rest of us, because I don't think it's just the rural or other folks. I think much of the care in the United States is suboptimal. The physicians are and other caregivers are too pressed for time. They're dealing with the health record problems, and so forth and so on. And clinicians I have visited still have clipboards, okay? I mean, so it's like they have to use the health records, and they also give you
Some don't even
clipboards.
use the health system.
Right.
Some of the more independent
Right.
is what I found.
Right. So my theory is that really to get where we need to go to get the science really advance in the way it needs to be would be the reform of the healthcare system. And I just don't see a lot of obstacles to getting that done.
I would say that they're bright, shining examples, but they're not ubiquitous, right? We don't see them across the country at scale, but I think that it's starting. I wouldn't say, if we were like 101, 201, 301 in terms of this transformation, we're talking, well, we're probably at 101B potentially. But the bright, shining places that I see, for example, you have the large tech companies to some extent who are now focused on this. I mean, I can throw out some examples around how do they create more of this transaction that's with transparency to consumers, treating healthcare almost like a consumer business, right? We're beginning to see that. We see the large retailers who are dipping their toes in clinical trials for, I mean, can you imagine a retailer that's selling just the goods and wares saying, I want to get involved in clinical trials, clinical research, because they see has to be both a business opportunity, but also the needs of the community. I also see partnerships that are forming that are fantastic partnerships, right? On food, right? Food is medicine, coupled with actually biopharmaceutical companies, coupled with care delivery, and then policies that support that. I think those are going to be very interesting going forward. I see a lot of investment that's happening in community-based research infrastructure. There's a new commitment actually by Dr. Bertagnoli, new NIH director, to say, I want clinical trials in primary care settings. That's a great signal out to the rest of the community to move towards that. And companies that are building, there just needs to be more, right? We just need more. We need more of a groundswell. We need more resources. We just need more commitment. And for those who are entering and they're tiptoeing into the space to not exit, because we have seen some exits already as well, because of the lack of incentives.
We need the incentives there, and we need the support for people to be in it.
That's right.
For the long haul.
But what I appreciate about, there are many things wrong in the U.S. Our fragmented healthcare system is abysmal, terrible. But we are also this incredible hotspot for innovation, which is fantastic. Right? When we're pressed against the wall, someone innovates.
Right.
And we need to just be very deliberate and intentional on finding those right innovations. We talked about some of them today, and scaling those innovations. It's going to happen both through practice at the company level, but it's also going to have to happen through policy.
Esther, don't you think that has to happen with the insurers and with CMS?
Absolutely.
Yes.
We cannot
Okay.
leave them out.
Because they have to enable this and not say, no, this isn't covered, okay, by. So to me, that's a big barrier to innovation, is the way that healthcare is reimbursing.
I absolutely agree with that. One of these moments for me was I was working with Auctioner and I was asking about those that come in on the clinical trials, and they said, well, if they don't have insurance, it's often hard to get them in the clinical trials. And that was a wake-up call for me, because I actually, in my 30 years, I did not know this. Okay? How did I not know this? Right? And I just think that over time, our society is not going to tolerate us. In other words, they're not going to tolerate the healthcare system the way it is. They're not going to tolerate the insurers the way it is, because the next generation coming up, they demand more.
Yes.
Because
they know more.
They know more. They can get it through retail, whatever. So they say, why can't I have the same?
Yes.
And so whether they're in the industry, whether they're in the healthcare system, or they're going to be a consumer of the goods and services of healthcare, I just think they're going to demand more, which means it's going to put everybody on their toes to continue to evolve faster, right? Like we've seen everything happens now, like almost at light speed, this evolution. I think we're going to start seeing this environment evolving, and it's not going to be we're not going to be able to hold it back if you want, right?
Hope so.
Janice, speaking of, because I think there's a reference here to have to bring all the stakeholders to the table. And it's TransCelerate, a membership-based organization who, we spend a lot of time collaborating across the ecosystem with multiple stakeholders. As we're wrapping up on time, I'd love if you could share just some thoughts about the role you think TransCelerate should be playing as we seek to build a more inclusive approach to both clinical research and just care more broadly.
Yeah, I think we already shared that we have, and also just through conversations, share pretty broadly that we have set an aspiration that where we see that convergence of clinical research and clinical care coming together. But we fully recognize that, TransCelerate is a part of that. And I think we started having that conversation. We need different stakeholders at the table, different leaders at the table to activate. I think TransCelerate, because we're 10 years in, and because we have the relationships and the credibility and the neutrality, we have an obligation, I look at it, is to activate some of these conversations. But also, more importantly, staying true to who we are as TransCelerate, to keep chipping away at the pragmatic solutions. Because even that alone is hard, and, but we are, but needed, right? Exactly, but needed. And that power of challenging the courage actually gets really amplified when you bring 20 companies together, and then we have the conversation with stakeholders in a meaningful way. But I do think that in the coming years, where I see the real opportunity is organizations like TransCelerate, also leaders from organizations represented here, to maybe activate that whole broader level stakeholder conversation. Certainly within the US, we have a lot of work to do, but also at a global level.
So we're approaching 5 minutes left. So we're on to the last question for all of you. And Joni, I'm going to start with you, and then we'll go down the table. And it is, what advice would you give to the next generation of leaders about the role they can play in inspiring inclusion, and really reflecting on some of the conversations we've had today, and I think kind of the work that we've laid out that sort of needs to get done to have a meaningful impact?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think one is to it's a journey for all of us. I think every day we have choices, and how we make those choices matters. And a lot of times I look around who's in my sort of ecosystem, and find people I like to kind of watch, and what are they doing? How do they handle this sort of question or challenge? I'm so glad Janet was in the FDA at 2020 and 2021, for example. Watching that leadership was, I think, transformative for a lot of, not just women and girls, but for a lot of people. So I think, find your mentors, your guiding posts. I'm not sure what to call them, but they may not be actual mentors, but they be people you admire and want to watch and emulate. I think that's one. And then I think the other thing is, as leaders now, we're all in a position to sort of open doors for others where we may not have had those open doors before. And I think it's an obligation for us to be able to be looking out for opportunities for those who are behind us, and helping them go through those doors by opening them for them. And so I think watching for those opportunities is another kind of thing that we can do as leaders. But when you're out there and you're not quite at that leadership stage yet, think about who you want to emulate, and then start to integrate that into your daily lives.
Janice?
Yeah, building upon that, I would say a couple of things. Watching who you want to emulate, but remember, we all have our own superpowers, right? And your superpower is different from my superpower, is different from Janice, right? And so on. And that's a good thing, right? But remember that we have to embrace our own superpower, starting with that. And I think we know what needs to happen. It's, for me, a lot of times it's about remembering as leaders the how we approach these conversations. And I go back to my 3 C's. Personally, I have 3 C's that I try and remember and find the right balance. It's around having the courage, right, to really challenge ourselves and challenge each other in whatever conversation, right, the status quo. Be genuinely curious. The curiosity aspect is really important, because that's where the openness, I think the humility aspect of making sure, be curious about learning about the other person's perspective and listen to them, really genuinely curious about it. And then last but not least is just compassion. I think that really brings a lot of empathy, right? When you can really try and put yourself, whatever topic or dialogue you might be having. I think for me personally, how I show up as a leader and following those 3 C's have guided me to really kind of foster a more inclusive environment for those around me.
Janet?
Well, I'll return to what I said at the beginning. I think openness is really important, and curiosity is part of that, to be truly open and curious about and that includes people who at the moment are in opposition to some of these ideas. Where are they coming from? Openness, and I think humility is really important. It's no matter how you work on yourself, you're always going to have unconscious biases. You're always not going to know everything. You're not going to know how it appears to somebody else, or how you're showing up to somebody else. And so I think that humility enables you to have even curiosity about yourself, what's happening, and really to bring that openness. So that would be my advice.
Well, I can't stop thinking about Janice's thing with the superpowers, because when I was a little boy, I used to watch Super Friends, and remember they all had like different powers, but they always, the Justice League, and so I'm gonna be thinking about that a lot now, right? But I think, so we're all caretakers, even in the roles that we have, right? So our job really is to make sure the next generation, right, kind of comes through, and we inspire them to do that. And we can only hope that we leave things better than we found them, right? For everything that we do, whether it be in our personal life or in our work life or in society. And so I think, finding the right people that you admire, and making sure that, particularly the next generation understands that you don't want to always be around people that are just like you, right? It's important to spread your wings, even if it's uncomfortable sometimes, Because when you experience that, you grow as a person and will grow as a society. So I think that would be some advice.
Esther?
Well, my advice would be, one, identify your true north. Understand what that is for you personally. It could be one of the issues, many issues that we laid out today. It could be about a particular disease. It could be about partnerships. But identifying your true north, that's always guided me my entire career, which is whatever issue I'm working on, how do I make an impact on that issue? And how do you remember the communities that are disproportionately impacted, right, by the issues that you're taking on? Because unfortunately, what we're talking about is life and death for many people. And they may not have the words to describe their experiences. But when you have a true north and you understand and you are curious about what those experiences are, that will guide you along the way. The second thing is just seek to have transformative impact. Incremental is somehow motivating, not really for me. I want big changes. And how do we identify those opportunities that we can take to scale, especially in this incredible country that we all get a chance to live in? I mean, we have such freedoms here. Mm-hmm. I speak for someone who did not grow up here and have benefited from being here in the US, that it's an incredibly rich country, not talking about economically rich, but just in so many different ways. So how do we just use this opportunity to identify solutions, scale those solutions, and have an impact? And the third is, maybe to the points that were raised, bring the right voices around the table. Mm-hmm. We should have tables like this. I want this table. I would like to pick this table up and take it with me. Have tables that reflect a bit of the constellation of the issues and challenges that you're trying to address. And that is just so critical. So if we can empower the next generation to do those things, and I think I'm in that next generation, so hopefully we can model some of these behaviors, I think we can achieve our goal.
So you are magical because we're right at time. So thank you for that. And just a heartfelt thank you to this incredible panel. You've been incredibly candid and gracious. You have not shied away from challenging conversations, and I think we're all the richer for it. And I think I speak for everybody that has joined us today. And Janet, a special thank you to you upon your retirement. Just you've built a wonderful legacy. I think we can all admit that we have learned from you. I've learned from you today and from your entire career. So enjoy your retirement. Thank you so much for all you've done. And that is all we have for today. Thank you to everyone who joined us today.